have a question, don't hesitate to interrupt. The reason for this is we have a pretty good idea about how long you remember things. About as long as we do. Second ground rule is if we ask a question, we really do want you to at least try to answer it. Now, Scout's oath, we won't charge extra for wrong answers. So, there's no reason for not to ask. But more important, probably the question you ask will also be in the minds of several others who are a little bit too timid to ask. Okay? I'd like to start out by asking you, in your lifetime, have you known any nation as rich or as powerful as the United States? Any nation at all? Good, I like to set that. And every once in a while somebody will mention Soviet Union or Japan, and then we take a few minutes to explain why these were not as rich or as powerful as we are. But listen, the reason we want to establish that much is because when we were growing up, the United States was not a rich, powerful nation. Now, reading textbooks, I know you usually get the idea that we've been very powerful ever since 1776. But it just isn't true. When we were growing up, the United States was very poorly armed. We were not a military power. We were about as rich as any country in the world in that we had more lines of railroads, more telephones, more radios than any other nation. We had more automobiles and more paved roads than any other nation. But that is not what establishes power. When we were growing up, the powerful nations were Great Britain, France, Germany, as you know, was becoming powerful. Italy already was, controlled Libya and Ethiopia. Spain and Portugal were powerful. The Soviet Union was very powerful just by the numbers of people it had and the vast territory it controlled. Japan was becoming powerful. Hey, and look, they were powerful because they controlled so much of the world. Great Britain had holdings in Central and South America, vast holdings throughout Africa, controlled India, Australia, Canada, parts of the Far East. France had an empire almost that big. This whole part of Africa was controlled by Portugal and Spain. Hey, you're mostly juniors, right? When I was a junior in high school, there were only 2 independent nations on that whole continent of Africa. 2. By the time I got to be a senior, it was down to 1. Because Italy had conquered Ethiopia. Now, what did we control? A couple of little islands out here in the Caribbean, right? We still control those. We had a 20-mile stretch through Panama. For what reason? Protect the Panama Canal. Okay, hey, we're old, but even when we were young, Alaska and Hawaii were part of the United States. What we controlled was little Wake Island out here, around here. We controlled Guam in the Marianas. And we also controlled the Philippines, right? Where did we get the Philippines? Right. And the year?
1890 something.
1898, just 100 years ago, right? Okay. However, the American people were not happy being an imperialistic nation. We didn't particularly want colonies. We didn't want to be a powerful nation to start with. But when we took control of the Philippines, of course, we sent an army out there to enforce our laws. Now, again, when you study history, you can't think of whatever area you're studying in terms of today's morals, today's ethics, and today's standards. You have to think of what they were like back then. Back then, in 1898, the Philippine Islands were a bunch of islands, and that was about all. They had no common government. They had never controlled themselves, governed themselves. Spain had never really governed them. They were just, you know how many islands there are in the Philippines? Right, about 800 islands. And the only communication these people had with each other was through, mostly through jungle drums, and for transportation they used dugout canoes. Now, nobody in the Philippines got to be powerful enough to control all those islands. And we made an attempt to, but in addition to the Army, our government also sent out a large number of civilians to teach the people about nutrition, about sanitation, and hygiene. And you know, it's amazing. The very first generation of kids after we took over the Philippines grew to be an average of 4 inches taller than their parents. I suppose the Filipino people felt about that. So that was a question. Remember the ability to try to answer questions? Right.
They probably felt like uncomfortable because like the younger generation was taller, probably like kind of more powerful. They probably didn't like that another country had come and like interfered with their society.
Okay. Yeah, that's one way to look at it. On the other hand,
I don't think it's
how would your parents feel if you grew to be healthy, strong?
They were happy. They were happy with the Americans game.
Yeah, you're darn right they were. You know,
Or they were happy.
over 50% of the children in the Philippines had been dying before they got to be 3 years old. And that came to a stop very soon. How would your parents? How would you feel if you knew that you had to have 3 children in order for one of them lived to be 20 years old? 2 out of 3 were going to die before they were born. And then along comes something so that all your kids grow up strong and healthy. You'd like that. Well, with that and the other ways that we treated our colonists, incidentally, which was very different from the way most of the European nations treated their colonies, a very warm feeling grew up between the Filipino people and the American people, not just the governments. And I'll give you an example of the kind of warmth that, and a lot of it still exists today, incidentally. During World War II, the Japanese invaded and conquered the Philippines. And you probably already know, an awful lot of Americans were trapped in the Philippines and became prisoners of war. But a lot of them were hidden from the Japanese by Filipino people. And sure, I know a few of you must be thinking, hey, big deal, so they hid some Americans. Well, it was a big deal. Do you know what the Japanese did if they found a Filipino hiding in American, or even suspected of hiding in American?
tortured until death.
In a very special way.
Water torture.
Water torture. Back then, see, there was only one big city in the Philippines, Manila. Most of the people lived in little villages, and of course, you know, they have their marketplace or their town square, someplace where the people gathered for communal things. The Japanese would gather the people into this village square, and while everybody was watching, they would behead the Filipino. But hey, not a real execution. They were using the average Japanese soldiers to do this, and you've seen pictures, I'm sure anyway, of the small Japanese swords that the soldiers used. And it was very gory because almost always the Japanese soldier would have to whack away several times to sever the head, and it was gory and bloody and ugly to watch. And I know some of you kind of doubt that. I think I just dreamed this story up. But about 2 years ago in Santa High School, a little Filipino girl came up to me and told me that her grandfather had told him several times about having seen his father and his uncle executed in just that way. And in spite of that, the Filipinos hid many Americans until the war was over. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out as one way in which Americans are very different from many other people. Maybe it's the cause because we get so much mixture of races and religions.
Well, we've been reading in our history textbooks that the Filipinos wanted their independence and that the Americans were treating the revolutionaries very violently.
Revolutionaries, yeah. Well, of course, what do you do with violent people? The revolutionaries were violent themselves. However, these revolutionaries, remember the Philippines had never been united, right? So what was it the revolutionaries wanted and who was behind them? It's a question you might find interesting in coming up the answer. Because in 1936, our government, I mean, there were so many objections by Americans to our even having a colony, that in 1936, the American government made an agreement with the Filipinos, and we said, look, in 10 years, we're going to give you 10 years to learn to govern yourselves and to learn to be a democracy. At the end of those 10 years, we're going to kick you out. You'll have none of the advantages or disadvantages of being part of the United States. And you know, prior to World War II, that's exactly what we did. Independence Day in the Philippines is July 4th, 1946. Well, we held it right the day we promised. You don't see any of those European countries doing that, right? Certainly Japan. Okay, well listen, with that much established, I want you to take a look at the map. You know pretty much who the powers were. Let's go back and talk about the beginning of World War II. And I'm going to have to cut this short because we have two other guys who want to tell you their experiences. But I'd like to remind you, who was it who came to power and started all that mess in Germany? Hitler. And very soon after he came to power, you know, he violated the Treaty of Versailles, occupied some territory. Well, Great Britain and France were the big powers in Europe. I mean, the biggest. And incidentally, does anyone else need to sign up, or is it done now? Thanks for seeing that I got my pen back. But, you know, they use the excuse, most of these people in the occupied lands are German anyway, so if Hitler wants them back, no. Is it worth starting a war over something like that? When that was done, he made the excuse, hey, the Austrian people are practically German, so I'm going to annex Austria. Now, how he did, I can't go into right now. But he did it, and Britain and France still said, hey, you know, we don't want to start a war over something like this. Let him have it. In the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, a lot of Germans lived. And Hitler said, these people should be in Germany, not in Czechoslovakia. That's really German territory. And the same thing happened. Britain and France tried to get Hitler to back down, and he wouldn't do it. So I said, well, okay, let him have that part of Czechoslovakia. Now, so far as the technology is concerned, if you really want to understand that era what I'm talking about, try to remember, back then, there were no satellites, right? Well, one satellite, okay. What was it? The moon. But we had no artificial satellites. We didn't have radar, no television. We didn't have supermarkets. We didn't have superhighways. As a matter of fact, the highways we had kind of laughed by today's standards. The highways back then were supposed to connect cities. Now most of the highways bypass cities, don't they? I mean, you go off there if you happen to want that, but if you don't want it, you shouldn't zoom right on past. But in order to connect the cities, the highways back then had to connect all the towns in between. And the trip just from Healdsburg to San Francisco was an all-day trip. because you went through downtown Healdsburg and then downtown, what was downtown Windsor. And these are on little two-lane roads, practically no shoulders, very poorly paved, maybe in some cases not paved at all. From there, you would go to downtown Santa Rosa, and I mean right smack through the downtown part of Santa Rosa. And from there, downtown Pengrove, downtown Petaluma, and so forth. So that by the time you got to Sausalito and were waiting for the ferry, the day was practically shot. So you'd wait until the next day, do your business, and then come back. Transportation is very different from what it is now because we had no large aircraft, certainly not jet planes. And if people traveled, they traveled by train. Well, a few people could travel by auto, but hey, back then a new car cost over $800, and not many people could afford that. But when the Prime Minister of Britain went out to talk to Hitler about Czechoslovakia, he came back and, of course, he reported to the British people. And would you believe, now here's London, here's the capital of Czechoslovakia. The Prime Minister spoke of Czechoslovakia as that little nation so far away. How far away is it? Look, from San Francisco to, make a guess.
Denver.
Salt Lake City. And that was a great distance back then. Okay, now getting back to Hitler, you know, of course, that he invaded Poland because he was telling his chiefs of staff that they're not going to go to war. They threatened that they would go to war if we invade Poland, but they won't. He said, look at all the other things I've done, and they haven't declared war. But he guessed wrong that time. And France and Britain did declare war. Unfortunately, what did they do? You know, here's Poland way over here. Here's France and Britain. They couldn't send any help. They couldn't do anything except declare war. And so Hitler moved in and took over what he wanted of Poland. I don't think your history books mention it. Hitler took over only about a third of Poland. The Soviet Union moved in and took over the other two-thirds. But anyway, war was declared. Now both France and Germany had built huge fortifications along their common border here. And so when war was declared, each country sent its army into these fortifications. Neither side was willing to attack. Now, when Hitler was moving into Poland and into Czechoslovakia, he used the word blitzkrieg, and it came into our vocabulary. What is blitzkrieg?
It's a battle where you have all forces going at once.
What does it mean? The word blitzkrieg. Lightning war. When this happened, after the war was declared, we call that a sitzkrieg. Kind of a pun. A sit-down war. And then, after Hitler consolidated his gains in Poland, we heard blitzkrieg all over again. Because Hitler moved up here, he invaded Denmark, conquered Denmark in one day. A little while later, he moved his army up into Norway, conquered the southern half of Norway. Came down here then and invaded the Netherlands. In 5 days, he conquered the Netherlands. 7 days more, he conquered Belgium. So here's the German army sitting on the French border here. Where's the most of the French army?
Maginot Line.
Behind their fortifications, yeah. I'm glad you know that term, the Maginot Line. But the road to Paris is open. Oh, there were some French army units up in here, sure, but not nearly enough. And so the road to Paris is open, the German army sweeps in, France surrenders. Now, in the United States at that time, during the same time, we weren't very interested in what was going on in Europe. You know, we read the newspapers, heard the radios. Actually, back then, at least where I lived, maybe one family out of two Yeah, a radio. A radio. How many of you kids have more than one radio in here? Yeah. Yeah. From what I understand, you kids won't even get into a car that doesn't have a radio and a CD and maybe a television in the back seat. But anyway, we didn't want anything to do. A lot of our people would say, hey, this is another one of Europe's family fights. What happens if you intrude into another family's fight? What usually happens? You've never done it? Never been trapped that way?
Well, a lot of times we don't walk to your house,
Well, usually if you get into a family fight, both sides turn on you. You don't make that mistake very often. And so Charles Lindbergh and a lot of our senators, representatives were telling us about this family fight they were having in Europe. And most Americans, you know, hey, we didn't want any part of it. We just wanted to get out of this depression we'd been in. And we were happy just to handle our own problems. But when France fell, that's when people started thinking a little bit differently about it. They said, hey, all these nations that Hitler has conquered, they were all democracies. Now Hitler's talking about invading Britain, and if he conquers Britain, where do we look for a friend? He's facing the world alone. And so some people got a little bit worried about that. Worried enough so that we decided we would at least sell Britain the things she needed to keep up the war. Now remember, I'm not only talking about war materials here. Britain has a population of over 60 million people. And these people need shoes and hats and food and clothing and soap. You know, all the things that unions did. And so we started manufacturing things just as fast as we could and sending them to Britain. And you know what happened to the ships, right? What happened to a lot of the ships that we were sending to Britain? See, he used the key word, the U-boats, German submarines. Okay, I don't want to deny that, but what I would like you to remember is Germany had not only the U-boats. Do you think Germany could have conquered all that much land if they hadn't had the world's best Air Force at the time? Pardon? No, Britain and France had Air Forces, and we had one. But, you know, not on a plane with the Germans. Germany also had a very powerful, although not large, was powerful and modern surface navy. And they kept a large part of the British Navy tied up right here to try to prevent them from getting out to the Atlantic Ocean. And they weren't always successful. But see, when we formed these, you know, of course, how later on we formed convoys to get this stuff across to Britain. Okay, so what do I mean by a convoy in this context?
Other boats, like military boats, would accompany the, like, merchant boats in them.
Let's call them ships.
Okay.
It's a little saltier, you know. So, okay, it's a group of merchant ships that are being protected by naval ships. Hey, what are you going to protect them against? Submarines, aircraft, or surface ships? You got to protect them against all of those, don't you? So, now I'm not talking about a convoy of 8 or 10 or 12 ships. You have to think in terms of 40, 50, in several cases over 100 merchant ships at a time. And you don't protect them with 5 or 6 warships. Believe me, some of these convoys were 10 miles across and 10 miles deep. It's a big job. Okay, the British had the world's biggest navy at the time. And they said, look, we'll escort those ships across, just put the stuff you want, we need in there. As a matter of fact, we're not thinking of becoming a world power even then. The British Prime Minister came to this country and he told the American people, give us the tools and we will do the job. So we believed that someday, if we gave Britain what she needed, someday Britain would invade the continent and free all those democracies. Well, they didn't do it. The British fleet could not get those ships across safely. So the American Navy decided to help out. Now I should tell you right here, at the time we had 3 fleets. We had a very small Asiatic fleet, as a matter of fact, it was so small that it was mostly submarines too, and a lot of them World War I submarines. We had 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and a bunch of submarines out there, that's all. We had an Atlantic fleet there. I just told you what our Atlantic fleet was going to do, right? We had a Pacific fleet, which was quite large, but gee whiz, you know, they were World War I ships mostly. You know, they had been built in 1917, 1918, 1919. And here it was, 1939, 1940. Lots of technological advances during that time. But anyway, the Atlantic fleet gets involved here, and the American government says, okay, we'll escort these convoys across to Iceland, and then the British Navy pick them up there and take them into London. And they were still losing too many ships. And so eventually the Atlantic fleet helped the British get the convoys all the way across. Still not expecting to be a world power, not wanting to be a world power. Hey, and you know why we didn't want to be a world power? I mean, does it sound kind of strange to you now? Okay, the reason. Why would we want to be a world power? I don't know why we want to be today. In spite of the fact that I know we are. We have good neighbors to the north and to the south, right? We have big oceans east and west. When I was your age, a fast ship would take pretty close to 7 days to cross that Atlantic Ocean. You think we were worried about anybody sending an army across to invade us? The Pacific Ocean, even wider. It took 2 to 3 weeks to cross that. Do you think we were worried about anybody sending an army across there to invade us? In addition to that, we were practically self-sufficient. We had almost every mineral, every raw material that we needed right within our own borders. Why would we want to get involved in all the problems of ruling other nations? We still don't do it. We didn't become a world power because we wanted to. Because we felt we had to. It's a big island, really, aren't we? And a very secure island at that. Okay, so now let's go up to 1941. 1941, June. We all expected Hitler was ready to invade Britain, and he fooled the world again. At least he fooled me. What did he do?
Air bombers.
Oh yeah, well he'd been bombing it for over a year, bombing the cities mostly because he'd been unable to wipe out the Royal Air Force. He turned his armies around and he invaded the Soviet Union, and oh boy, blitzkrieg all over again. I mean, the German armies smashed through the Russian armies in Poland, smashed into the Russian armies down here, conquered the Baltic countries, moved out here into the Soviet Union, all the way up to the very outskirts of Moscow. What used to be Leningrad up here, Stalingrad down here. This is Volgograd now, and that's St. Petersburg. But I mean to the very outskirts. As a matter of fact, German troops were actually in the city of Stalingrad. The German army had come down here to help the Italian army, which was having trouble. They defeated the British time after time, fought almost to the Suez Canal. And believe me, it looked for all the world like Hitler was going to win. It really did. It was pretty scary times. As I say, they were all the way up here ready to cut the lifeline, Britain's lifeline, to the Far East. And of course, you know, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, a lot of Americans said, hey, we have to help the Soviet Union just like we're helping Britain. Great idea, because, hey, come on, you know, with Britain and Russia together, you know they're going to defeat Hitler, right? Well, we knew it anyway up until the German army got so deep inside of the Soviet Union. Okay, now you try to hold that picture, which is a pretty desperate one, for just a few minutes while we talk about Japan. And you know, of course, Japan wanted to become a world power, practically ever since Admiral Perry opened it up to the world. In the 1920s, well, let's see if you can come up with some of the raw materials and natural resources that that nations need to become a world power. Petroleum, right.
Lumber, steel,
Hardwoods,
steel,
coal.
steel.
Where do you get steel from? From iron. The iron and the coal, you can make steel. What else? Oh, hey, most high schools forget that, although it's their favorite natural resource. What else?
Textiles, people.
Certain textiles, but you have, you're going to manufacture the textiles.
Cotton.
Pardon?
Cotton.
Okay. What metal brings electricity into this room? Copper. And then you need zinc, tin, lead. One other raw material that you kids would be just about lost without. What? How would you like to ride in a car that had no rubber? Okay. Now, rubber still, 90% of the world's rubber from here, British Malaya. Petroleum. Isn't there petroleum anybody could want in what we call the Dutch East Indies? And why did we call it that? The food. Hey, here's the rice bowl of Asia. French Indochina. Why French? So in the 1920s, Japan invaded Korea hoping to get the natural resources it needed. You realize, of course, Japan had none of those natural resources, right? Japan couldn't even feed its people without importing food. They invaded Manchuria later. When I was a junior in high school, Japan already controlled most of the coast of China. And the Japanese army, believe me, is a very brutal force. You don't want to run across anything like that. So try to imagine now, when did I say the Soviet Union was ready to collapse? June of 1941. So in June of the invasion started in June of 1941. 2-3 months later, say August, maybe September, the German army is way up inside here. They pushed across North Africa, and the Japanese military people, you know, they read newspapers, they hear radio reports. Can't you just picture them in the meeting saying, hey, the French can't control this part of the world anymore. Why not? Absolutely, Germany conquered them. The Dutch can't control this part of the world anymore. Why? The British can't control this part of the world anymore. Why? What an opportunity. What does it look like the Japanese can do very easily now? Move in and take over all that land and all those resources. By the time they're through fighting in Europe, they expect to have all their conquests fortified. They're never going to have to give them back. What an opportunity, you know. The plum just waiting to be picked. Except they're wondering, hey, what are the Americans going to do with their Pacific Fleet? Are they going to send the Pacific Fleet out and try to interfere with us? Now, I'm going to digress here, but just a couple of minutes. Tell you what the American people were thinking in terms of war. because this country, believe me, was split right smack down the middle on what, if anything, we should do about the war in Europe or about stopping Japan's conquest. I mean, Charles Lindbergh and several others were telling us, stay out, it's a family fight. Others were saying, hey, you know, our destiny is tied up in this, and there was no agreement. In 1940, in April of 1940, the United States Congress passed a draft act. You all know what a draft act is, right? Yeah. Anybody wants me to explain it? Okay. They passed the draft act, but they weren't the least bit sure the American people would obey that law. That's the kind of division we had back then. They made it effective for 1 year. Come on, let's be honest. Do you believe we could build an army or a navy in 1 year? Build an army and a navy in 1 year? No way. Okay, so we had started building some ships in 1938 to 1939. But it takes years and years to build fighting ships. Merchant ships can turn out kind of fast, but naval ships take longer. This draft act then expired in April of 1941, right? April. And came up to be renewed. Because if it hadn't been renewed, it would simply expire. It passed your House of Representatives by 1 vote. Does that tell you how this country was divided on what, if anything, we should do? That's what we were facing back then. We'll start passing this down. And I'd like you to just check it out, pass it on to the next person. This is a 3-inch shell, armor piercing. It's gone through, well, the one before it went through it. Of course, they just took this one. This is from the Naval Proving Ground. Just put this in there to show you what did it. As I say, it's a 3-inch shell, 3 inches in diameter. Now, the battleships we had at Pearl Harbor didn't fire little stuff like this. They fired shells that were 14 and 16 inches in diameter. This tall, and those now that's not counting the powder to fire them. You put the shell in and then 3 or 4 bags of gunpowder behind them. And those battleships would throw those shells 20 miles and hit a target just a little bit bigger than this classroom. And they don't fire them one at a time. They try to fire 3, 6, maybe 9 at a time. So they're very powerful, right? Unfortunately, they were built for what? What war did I tell you they were built for? World War I. They were never modernized. They were not built to fight aircraft. And they weren't sleek, modern vessels. You know, we would try to get so much done to supply Britain, to rearm ourselves, to build our army, to support the Soviet Union, and we just couldn't do everything. So these ships have never been modernized. I think they just recently put some primitive radar on them before the attack. So they weren't really what you would call first-class fighting ships. The Japanese had decided, hey, maybe instead of waiting for the American Navy to come out and interfere with us, we can think of something better. And they came upon a plan. Now, that didn't make the floor, did it? No. It's been dropped twice. It's been handled by over 20,000 high school kids, and it's only been dropped twice. So, anyway, these ships are not modern. The Japanese know pretty much any time our ships come into port. And the Pacific Fleet had been out on battle practice, came back into port, and distributed itself like this throughout Pearl Harbor. These are the battleships tied up to the Naval Air Station. This is the submarine base. This is our naval base. You know, where they repair ships. Every one of these You've been over to Richmond, I'm sure, and you've seen those huge gas tanks sitting on the hill. Every one of those is one of those gas tanks, right out in the open. The Japanese plan is to attack when they know our fleet is going to be in Pearl Harbor, refueling, reprovisioning, and see if they can't damage it bad enough so it won't interfere with their operations. They choose to attack on a Sunday morning. Pretty good idea. Why?
Church.
People going to church, getting ready to go ashore, right? People sleeping in late. What else?
That's people to kill. They were worried about it.
No, they weren't worried about that. But anyway, and they chose to attack early on the Sunday morning. However, they chose to attack without declaring war. As a matter of fact, they had special emissaries in Washington, D.C. scheduled to talk to our Secretary of State at the very time the attack was going on. And that's why we call it a sneak attack and not just a surprise attack. Hey, believe me, there were plenty of surprise attacks during World War II. Pearl Harbor wasn't the only one, but it was the sneak attack. When they left, now they had launched a fleet 3 weeks before to cross the Pacific Ocean. When they got north of Hawaii, they turned south. And on the morning of December 7th, 1941, they launched 353 dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, and level planes to attack our fleet. When they left, 2 hours later, every one of those battleships was sunk or severely damaged. Have any of you been to Hawaii?
Yeah.
Did you go aboard the Arizona Memorial?
Yeah.
Well, you should. She's still there. Very early in the engagement, see, the battleship Arizona had just taken aboard over 1 million pounds of ammunition. Very early in the engagement, one of the Japanese bombs went through her deck and exploded amongst part of the ammunition, and that, of course, set off the rest of it. I was a half mile away when that bomb exploded. Remember, she was floating. The ground where I was shook. And for a couple of seconds, I thought the Japanese had hit these oil drum tanks.
How old were you when that happened?
Almost 19. And these guys were probably pretty close to the same age. But the Arizona burned all day Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Wednesday, I didn't see any more smoke coming. But 1,100 men died in that explosion.
They were on the boat.
1,100. And of course, they're all, or what's left of them, still there. They never tried to salvage this ship or make any repairs to it. It's utterly destroyed. And she's just there rusting away, and probably one of these days will collapse and just become a big pile of rust. I'm going to pass these pictures around. You check one out and pass it around, if you will. The important thing, though, is although every one of these ships was sunk or severely damaged, most of them were later raised and got back into the war. They were modernized and got back into the war. Now, Harry and Bill both were on the battleship West Virginia, right here. I'm going to let them tell you a little bit about their experiences, and then we'll get back and maybe I'll tell you what happened on the submarine base, too. Oh, wait a minute. Thanks, Harry. I almost always forget. Hey, hold it here for a minute. I need everybody's attention for this. I have here a Japanese and a German bayonet. Now, do you all know the difference between a knife and a bayonet?
Yeah.
Who doesn't? Okay. See that little slot on both of those? That's made to fit on the end of a rifle. So that this fellow now has not only a gun, he's got a lance or a spear as well, right? In case he runs out of ammunition or things happen too fast. I'd like to pass these around and have you feel free to take them out of the scabbards if you'd like and examine them. But first, I need an agreement, and I mean by every last one of them. Nobody is gonna act silly with them. Nobody is gonna threaten anybody with them. In other words, you can be just as mature with these as 15,000 other high school people who handle them already. Now, do I have that agreement or no?
Yeah.
I want to see the hands or they go back. Okay, I trust you. I'll start the Japanese one over here and the German one over here. Hey, make a guess. Why do you suppose the Japanese one is a little bit longer than the German one?
They're shorter.
Shorter people probably have shorter arms. Maybe that's what to make up for the difference. Okay, Japanese one here, German one here, and Harry right here.
Look at the bullet. It's over there. It's right by
Looking good.
You can do it this way.
Like Frank said, I was on the USS West Virginia, so I was in the deck force. Here is the ship after it was torpedoed and bombed. Pearl Harbor is shallow. This is setting right on the mud. This inboard here is the Tennessee. They was trying to get the Tennessee with the torpedoes and go under us. We received 9 torpedoes and 2 bombs. As this sketch shows where each one of them torpedoes hit and where the 2 bombs hit. The Tennessee only received 2 bombs. This is a picture of one of the torpedoes they used. They manufactured on the end of the torpedo where they could put wood. Most torpedoes would go down and they'd go at about 15 feet. But with the shallow water, what have you, so they invented this so they'd rise to the surface where they wouldn't go under. The night before the attack, these 3 boys was over at Pearl City at the beer joint having beer and having a good time. They were down below decks. They never come out. They were down underneath there, all watertight, they couldn't get out. They lived for 16 days after the attack. You could hear them. They had guards coming aboard ship when they was working on it. And these guys down there had a piece of metal or something and it was knocking on the bulkhead so you could find them. Well, then we didn't have no way of getting down there or getting them out. For 16 days they lived down there. They had water, they had food, but they run out of oxygen. I'll pass these around so you can see them. And also when you look at this picture now, you can kind of visualize, we wasn't always looking this old, we were young too. This 3-inch gun here, which is what it was passed around, is an anti-aircraft gun. That was my station. We had it forward and aft, we had 16-inch guns. The projector stands this tall, weighs 2,100 pounds. They could fire from here to Cloverdale and hit a room about this size with that shell. So, I mean, it was quite, but they fired, we had cockroaches on board ship. And they fired these 2 guns forward and aft. The ship would move over 6 feet in the water when they fired that way. You'd kill the cockroaches for about 3 decks. But they worked their way back up. I was on there until the fire burned out. We had our captain was up here on the bridge. He got strapped up, killed him. He lasted about 15 minutes after the attack started. Lieutenant White then was there with him. Dick Fisk, the Marine bugler, and he wouldn't let them take him off the bridge. Lieutenant White stayed in the Navy, become a captain later on. He stood about 6'6", feet on him about like that. He stayed there till the shoes burnt off his feet. So afterward, nobody had shoes that size. So his wife was there, she had no duty, so they sent her back. She found a pair of shoes his size, but you can only ship so much weight in a package. So she had to send the shoes in 2 different packages. He received one shoe, 3 months later he received the other one. We used to call him Snowshoe, not to his face. And here in about '82, we had a reunion in Charleston, West Virginia. Come in, and he signed the log captain. When I go ski, this boat's and he says, that isn't your name. He sketched it out. And what is it? He wrote down snowshoes. The next reunion, 2 years later, we met in Tacoma, and he came in and he signed his name, Snowshoes. Real nice gentleman. I sat at the table and had dinner with him and his wife and talked some stories to him. I think he's gone now. He lived in Florida quite a while. He was up in his 80s then. We had Dean Darrell, who was on board ship, and got blown off of the ship, was picked up by a motor launch. And he was hurt, so they took him to the hospital and patched him up, sent him back to duty. He would sleep anywhere for 15, 20, 24 hours at a time. This wasn't normal, so they sent him back over and they x-rayed him again. This time went in from the side. He had a jack bullet in his heart, and he was still going around. So they sent him back here to the United States, and they told him in May, they said, now this heart surgery is a new thing. You might get about a 50-50 chance to recover on this. There was a little nurse there, and he said, well, if I come out of this, will you go out with me? Now, this is May, and I think June or July they got married, and he lived for 50 more years. He died right after the 50th anniversary. Real nice gentleman. After they told us to abandon ship, I went over to Tennessee, and I helped pull off some life rafts. There was a Marine and another sailor and me, and we were swimming over the side. When I went through boot camp, one of the qualifications, you had to be able to swim that pool back and forth and carry a pack a lot of times. Here there was kids down there that didn't even know how to swim. But I remember when I went through boot camp, this one kid, he come from a fairly wealthy family, didn't know how to swim, so he gave the instructor $20. Okay, you know how to swim. $20? We only made $21 the whole month was in there. That's what our pay was, $21 a month. So when that's twice a month, you know what you got. If you got a chit out, you didn't have much left. So I went, an officer hollered to get the hell out of there. And as I drove over the side, a bomb landed, killed him and 2 enlisted men. On our ship, we lost, I think it was 107 men, 4 of them officers and the rest enlisted men. On the fantail of our ship, here, when the Arizona went up, body parts from these boys on the Arizona landed on the ship we were on. It blew up. They picked them up for quite a few days later on. Anyway, as I went over the side, where the Arizona blew up, they'd just taken on a bunch of fuel, ammunition, and everything else. And here this fuel was on top of the water burning. The Tennessee started its engines, put its screws on, was keeping the fire away from us. But we still had that muck. And when we went through that, it is muck, it's mud. That old bunker fuel is worse than molasses. It's thick. You can't wipe it off. You have to scrape it off. I went out there to Fort Island, big hangar here, and I went in there, but with all these ships damaged and down, that hangar was full of boys. And they said, well, they sent me down here, which was officers' quarters. When I went into the officers' quarters, the officers' wives helped us clean up. And I went back to Tennessee that night. There was a buddy of mine, him and I went through boots together. And I spent the night there. Then I went back to Fleet Landing the next morning. On December 7th, the morning we attacked, about 5 minutes to 8 when it happened. Milton East, a buddy of mine, him and I was getting ready to go ashore. And we're not going to make the first Liberty boat because the boys go to church and all that. So we went, we were shining our shoes. And they sounded the attack. I took my shoes and put them on my locker. I never saw them again. And I was 3 weeks before I could get a pair of shoes. And I wore those thongs. We call them Japanese moccasins. And before I could get a pair of shoes, I got kind of tired of them then. Captain White, when he lost his shoes, he went down to Carpenter, and the carpenter cut a shoe out, wooden piece, fit his foot. Then they nailed a piece of canvas over the top. But on them steel decks, when you walked on it, he was making so much noise, The admirals said, oh no. So they got what you might call rope, we called it line, and nailed it across the bottom so it would quiet it down. When I went on, we went over fleet landing that next day, and Milt and I and a couple other buddies, and here's the whole list of ships. I said, "Gee, what ship did you get?" We look at me, say, "I got a buddy on the Lexington." Well, the Lexington was an aircraft carrier. And this is one reason the Japanese did not come back in and attack us again. Our aircraft carriers weren't in the harbor. They didn't know where they're at. So I went to the Lex, got on it. We went out to sea. We had a run on Bougainville. The torpedo planes went out, and the Jap ships there. They were shallow draft. They dropped the torpedo just went right under their ships and just right up the bank. Because they're shallow draft and we're set deep. So we came back. We came in, we never got a hit. The Jap plane tried to get us, 2-engine bomber. And when it came in, all the ships on the Lex was firing all the anti-aircraft guns. And you could see the Japs just bend over the seat. When you see the tracers, about every fifth one is a tracer where you can watch it go right into the nose of this airplane. And they're coming right at us. And finally, it veered off just a little bit after the fantail that hit the water and exploded. On the flight deck was the torpedo planes, the fighters, and everything. The boys, the radio men and the pilots, all sitting in these planes. Well, if it hit right in there, it wiped all them out. So for 2 weeks after that, we went down. We'd have chow. There was a brick of ice cream and a pack of cigarettes that these officers brought us. We spent 3 months out there. We got a little hungry. They run out of a lot of food. They had no potatoes left, no vegetables hardly. They boiled rice and they cooked it in the morning. That was your mush. They boiled rice at noon. That was your potatoes. And then they had Spanish rice for supper. And we ate tuna for 3 weeks. I eat rice today, but I'm not particularly fond of tuna. We got back in and we loaded up again. What time did we got on this?
We've got about 20 minutes yet, I
Okay.
guess.
Leave you talking, knows more about it than I do.
Hey, that's the whole
No,
point.
it won't fit. So we came back in, loaded on up, and went back out. We got in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Lex went down in the Battle of the Coral Sea, but with our planes and that, a couple others, the Japanese had a big armada heading to Australia. They were going to take Australia. We knocked aircraft, destroyers, and everything out. That broke off the attack. I spent 4 hours in the water before I got picked up. Swimming. I saw a ship out there. They'd come by you in the motor launch. Oh, he's doing all right. Just let him go. When I got to the Anderson destroyer, I got shoved down in the water 3 times. Because I wasn't alone trying to get up there. So finally, when she rolled back, I put my feet against the bulkhead, threw both arms back, put them in the air. Guy caught me one on each hand and heaved me in the middle of the deck almost as far from here to there. One shoved a cigarette in my mouth, another shoved a cup of coffee in my hand. Now, a lot of the students ask us, were you afraid? Were you scared? I guess we all were afraid sometimes, scared sometimes. But you used to think how monotonous it is going through these drills, doing it over and over, your gunnery practice over and over. But it paid off. During the action, you never even thought about that. You did what you were supposed to do. That night, well, I remember on the 1.1 on the Lexington, if it misfired, you took a lanyard or a rope, whatever you want to call it, you had to wrap around it, and it was so tight, you put your leg and pull it before you could get it open. You had to leave it set a half hour, then you'd catch a shell and throw it in water. Big boy from Texas reached under there with his hand like this, just pulled it back, caught it through the shell over the side. Just as cool and calm as you can be. That night on the destroyer, he was down under the stacks, the shock set in, he was crying like a baby. So I mean, you just do it over and over, just like you're studying. If you do it long enough, you'll understand what you're doing and it comes to you. Okay, Joe, I can say some more about what you get out of. Joe, Joe was below decks and I was topside.
Yeah, we were on the same ship, and, well, I joined the Navy in 1939, on my 19th birthday. That's when the Navy started to take recruits in and things like that. And I helped put an ammunition ship back into commission, and we came through the Panama Canal. That's when I got into West Virginia in July of 1940. And of course, we made the trip to Hawaii then we came back to San Pedro. We went to the Navy Yard in San Francisco. And we left in January 1941. We went to Hawaii. And I was, well, when they sounded general quarters, it's just automatic, you go to your battle station. And my battle station was down in the central plotting room of the ship. Well, of course, if I would have got there, I wouldn't be here today, because as Harry said, we got torpedoes. And the ship started to capsize, got a pretty good list to it. Some officer and some enlisted man had the brains, they was probably in damage control, opened sea valves on the other side, counterflood the ship, so that eventually just settled down. I don't know how long we were locked down below deck. But eventually they opened the hatch and we got up out of there. And there wasn't much happening down below because it was dark and you didn't know whether there was anybody else around or not. And when we finally got out, they wanted me to go over on the Tennessee. We're down in this 16-inch gun turret. Being locked below decks once was enough for me. And that night, I wound up over at the Fleet Landing where the receiving ship was. And I can't tell you how I got over there or what I did in the meantime. But they was calling names out for people to go out on these ships. And I was a seaman first class, but actually I was a storekeeper striker. So I didn't answer the call for seamen. And the next day, I got sent over to Ford Island there. And I stayed there for 10 months. And when I left there, I was a storekeeper second class. And then I went out to Fiji Islands and New Hebrides, Guadalcanal.
Fiji Islands in here. New Hebrides.
I was with the service unit for what they called the Black Cat Squadron, which was PBYs, which they used for rescue and observation of planes. And I finally managed to get back to the States in February of 1944. And I stayed back there and I got married in June, or no, May. I left in July. I was on a fresh and dry provision barge that had to be towed with a tug wherever we went. And we finally wound up in Saipan, us and another one, and some underwater disturbance came up, and we got pushed on a coral reef and pushed the rudder up through it. So we had to abandon ship. Waves were breaking over the deck, and an LCM came out to rescue us. And I got tangled up in a line, and I was underneath this LCM and heard that prop turning. If you don't think that was something. But then the end of the war, I was up in Okinawa, where all these suicide planes were attacking the ships, wiping the decks clean. And that was the biggest thing that I ever saw. That's
We have our chapter here of Pearl Harbor survivors. We have 2 men up in Lake County. One's Herman and the other Layton. Layton was from Healdsburg, Herman was from Windsor, and I joined here in Santa Rosa. At that time, the courthouse was right down in the middle of that park as we had to drive around. We had the Earlston School, the old Earlston School, and one high school. You've got more high schools in Santa Rosa than we had in the whole county there. So you see how things have changed quite a bit since then.
Hey, you know, every once in a while, somebody asks us if the pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor were kamikaze pilots. No, they weren't. They were good pilots. You've heard the term kamikaze, right? And do you know what it means?
Divine.
Divine wind, yeah. This was just another slogan the Japanese were using. They were getting beaten pretty badly. Most kamikaze pilots were 14, 15, 16-year-old kids. They weren't good. Their job was to go out and dive their plane into an American ship, that's all. They never got enough gasoline to go back. They didn't get enough training to learn how to be good, because by that time, the reason they instituted the kamikazes was we had killed most of their good pilots. Now, so far we've been talking about Pearl Harbor. One day in a war that lasted over 1,300 days. You know how long 1,300 days is? The kids who were freshmen in high school when World War II started had already graduated by the time it was over. That's a long time. And in the early part of the war, the Japanese Navy was beating the tar out of our Navy in the South Pacific. The tide eventually turned, and we were coming up with more and more ships. This is when the United States really started to change from this young, innocent nation that I was telling you about in the beginning of the period, started to become a world power. We produced more equipment during those few years. I'm sure it would astound you even now. I don't think the country could do it now. But the numbers, we had 2,500 airplanes of all types, in the military airplanes in the United States when the war started in 1941. By 1943, we were producing 95,000 aircraft a year. I told you Britain's Navy was so immense that we thought they could handle the convoy. They had the world's biggest Navy in 1939. By 1945, we had outclassed them amazingly. We had the world's biggest Navy. We had the world's biggest and best Air Force. Japan, remember I said the Japanese sent 6 aircraft carriers across the Pacific to attack Pearl Harbor? When the war ended, we had 66 aircraft carriers. We had at least 14 battleships, 10 of them very modern ones. It was amazing. And in the course of this, of course, we were constantly fighting the Japanese. We had one battle around the Marianas Islands. Actually, it's called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, because even by then, we had destroyed an awful lot of the Japanese flyers. And on one day, our guys shot down 400 Japanese planes that were attacking our fleet. Amazing. We started becoming a world power because by the time the war was over, our enemies was defeated, smashed, and our friends were exhausted, physically, financially, industrially. We became a world power by default because the Soviet Union started moving in and taking over most of Eastern Europe. And it's then that the American people said, hey, we don't want communism, you know, we're not going to let communism take over the world. We wouldn't let Nazism take over the world, but we're not going to let communism do it too. I do pass around some photographs, and I don't usually get a chance to talk about these. I pass these around so you can get a pretty good idea of what I saw. Yes?
I have a question for all of you. How have your experiences affected your lives? Because they seem pretty traumatizing. Has a day gone by where you don't think about it, or do you always go back to those days and think about it?
These few years changed the world so fantastically. I can't imagine what it would have been like if there had not been World War II or if we had lost it. And let me tell you, there were times when it seemed like it was hanging on a thread that we might very well lose it. I wasn't at all sure that the country would do anything after Pearl Harbor because we had been split so badly clear up to December 7th. I told you, the Draft Act, right? How many people were opposed to our doing anything? I couldn't imagine the nation coming together the way it did and producing the miracles. I don't know, how do you guys feel about it?
That's true. And a lot of you, like the atomic bomb, if we hadn't had that, a lot of you people wouldn't be here. Because your grandfathers and that were in these wars, when we went, we were going to take Japan. There was a little island right off of Japan. It would have taken 150,000 of our soldiers just to take this island so we could attack Japan. So out of the 200,000 that we killed with the atomic bomb, that was a drop in the bucket what Japan had killed in China. They took Hong Kong and they killed 150 people. They went took the coast of Manchuria and they killed 200,000-300,000 people. People don't know this.
You're right about the rape of Nanking sometime. Now, Nanking was not a woman. Nanking was a Chinese city. Well, these Japanese were military brutal at that time.
We do have some members yet that they relive it and they hit it pretty hard. We try to look back on the fun we had, not on the bad times. And you've got to put a lot of that stuff out of your mind. It's not easy because I used to jump. When I went on the Lexington, when the planes would land, there's a cable across and they had a hook would catch this cable. And we pulled out of Pearl Harbor, and I had my chow tray just getting ready to set down, and one of these planes landed. And that hook was right above my head. I took it through that tray as far as you could see it. Kids laughed like heck at me, but I got even with them later. Another time I was over here at Crow's Landing. I became a cook later on, because I found out they got the best chow. Crow's Landing, I was in charge of the galley there, and I was talking to the OD, and somebody dropped a big aluminum pan on a tiled deck. I had that officer by the neck, and I was choking until he turned blue. I finally let go, and I thought, I'm sorry. He never talked to me again unless there was a table between us. I mean, it takes a lot. You have to do a lot to try to get away with some of them things, because you are jumping, getting through them, but you just can't help yourself. But it just takes work. And trying to forget them. We have some members that go to pieces when you start talking about it.
I passed these pictures around so you could see pretty much what I saw on December 7th. See, I was in submarines, and these two fellows were on battleships. And on the morning of December 7th, my buddy and I were getting ready to go ashore. And he saw the planes as soon as they came in, and he noticed some smoke, and we found out very quickly what that smoke was caused by. So we ran down to, we were on the third deck of the submarine barracks. We ran down 3 flights of stairs, grabbed a rifle, a bayonet, and an ammunition belt, and ran down to my ship, which was, well, what, maybe 200 yards away from here down to here. And just as we got there, something happened. I can't remember what it was, but we stopped. And while we're stopped there, along comes a photographer and takes our picture. Okay, so he didn't take our picture. He was really taking a picture of what was happening in the background. But he caught us on both of these pictures. Now, I can't prove to you that this is me in red, because our backs are turned. I tell you, if I'd known the photographer was there, I would have turned around and given him a big smile, tap dance and all. But anyway, the reason I know it was us is because there's the rifle, the ammunition, the bayonets, and the ammunition belts. Now, I was completely dressed, ready to go ashore, a nice, clean, white uniform, except I hadn't put my neckerchief on yet. And in this picture, the sailor's collar is blowing. There's no black neckerchief showing. Yeah, what Harry was telling you about the atomic bombs, and I'm real glad you bring this up, because I had a rather startling experience about that, that I think might help you to understand how we felt. You see, as the war was drawing to an end, I was out on Guam at a submarine base. Mariana's right here. There's Guam. And the Navy had built a couple of ships that would act as submarine bases, and I was on one of those. Now, out there, you can imagine, we couldn't hear any American radio stations at all. We couldn't hear the Australian radio station, but we could hear Radio Tokyo. And so, they had a gal called, we called her Tokyo Rose. And she would broadcast in English, played good American. Hey, look, I know you like your music. We liked ours at that time, too. And that's all she would do. She would play our music, and then she would have, instead of a commercial, you know, a propaganda slot, and another good record, and then more propaganda. And, you know, we liked the music, so we listened to her, and we knew that the propaganda was just so much garbage, because they would tell us how many times they had sunk the same ship over and over, how they were destroying all our aircraft and their... But, you know, we wanted to hear the music, so we listened. Now this, as I said, was as the war was winding down. We were getting ready to invade Japan. And I'll tell you why that was so scary at this time. We were getting ready to invade Japan because the war in Europe was over. Okay, we've got the world's biggest air force in Europe. We've got a war going on in the Pacific. What are you going to do with that air force? Send it to the Pacific. The Atlantic Fleet doesn't have anything to do anymore, does it? The war's over. Germany had surrendered. What are you going to do with the Atlantic Fleet? Send them to the Pacific. We had an army of 5 million men in Europe. We don't need them anymore, right? What are you going to do with them? Right, send them to the Pacific. This was such a huge operation that I'm sure it wasn't possible to keep it secret. You can't ship that many men and that much machinery for 12,000 miles and keep it a secret. Most of us knew it was meant we were getting ready for preparing for the invasion. We were prepared to invade Japan in November. And so I'm talking about August now. You know, not much time from August to November. It's September and October. And I'm listening to this Radio Tokyo, and Tokyo Rose said something I will never forget, because they knew the invasion was coming. And she said, American soldiers and sailors, when you invade, we're willing to take 20 million casualties. How many would you take? And you know, you start sweating a little bit when you drop it right in your lap like that. But Japan was defeated. Japan was beaten badly. They wouldn't surrender. They were going to continue fighting. And I tell you, they were arming the women and children in Japan with bamboo spears. We've got a couple of minutes. I want to tell you why. The Japanese at that time, well, I guess most of you kids are fairly religious, but the Japanese at that time believed their emperor was a living God. You try to imagine how you would feel if God lived among you, and you knew what he looked like, you knew where he lived, you saw his reports about what he was doing in the papers every once in a while. That's God. They believed it. They were taught the most glorious thing a Japanese could do would be somehow to die for the glory of the emperor. On the other hand, the most disgusting thing the Japanese could do under any circumstances would be to surrender to an enemy. And so you have this strange type of thinking that they're not going to surrender, and it's a glory to die. That's it. That's a free pass to heaven, to die for the emperor. Now you meet these people out on a battlefield somewhere, what's it going to be like?
think we can be really careful with.
Two people might go out on that battlefield, but only one's going to come off. Maybe none, but not more than one. Because they could, it didn't matter how they died. It was the glory of the emperor, the ticket to heaven. Even committing harikari or suicide was more acceptable than surrender. And this is one of the reasons they treated our prisoners of war so brutally. Because you were nothing if you surrendered. Nothing. You were worse than an animal. And you deserved to be treated that way. This permeated the people so much. Now when our Marines conquered the island of Saipan, which is just north of Guam here, they had cornered about 400 civilians. Civilians, mind you, on a cliff overlooking the ocean. And they stopped. You know, they had secured the island. And they got out the translators and their bullhorns and they called to these people and they said, look, the fighting is over. We know you need medical attention. We know you need food. We know you need clothing. Come in and we'll take care of you. And do you know what they did? First they threw the babies off the cliff and the children. Then they jumped. And you know, you watch this History Channel and they come up with those film clips every once in a while, showing people jumping and throwing the kids off the cliff. That they could do, they couldn't surrender. When we invaded the island of Iwo Jima, there were 27,000 Japanese soldiers defending it. And when the fighting's over, we have 200 prisoners. What happened to 26,800 Japanese soldiers? They pack up and leave, you know. So that's the kind of fighting it was. And here we're getting ready not to invade a little offshore island. We're going to invade their homeland. What kind of fighting do you suppose that would have involved? We expected to take 1 million casualties on the invasion. And I think back, 1 million Americans have been killed or severely wounded in invading Japan. As Harry said, you might not be here. It would sure as heck have altered the lives of your grandparents, right? And if it altered the lives of your grandparents, it would have a great effect on what happened to your parents. Or you might never have been born. And as he pointed out, by comparison, 200,000 people who were killed by the atomic bombs really was nothing compared to the 20 million they had been willing to sacrifice for the invasion. Now, why do you suppose the Japanese surrendered? Would you like to make a guess? But I just figured it out recently.
The emperor decided to surrender, and I heard previously that he wasn't the one really controlling the war, it was the military leaders of that time. He didn't want to see people hurt anymore.
He controlled the military. Yeah, you're right. A lot of people think it was the atomic bombs that caused the end of the war. Some people think, hey, we had Japan surrounded. Our submarines had done this during a year and a half before the war ended. Now our surface fleet was surrounding Japan. She couldn't import anything anymore. The people were literally starving. Some people say, hey, but the Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria and was defeating the Japanese army up in here, and that's why she surrendered. But I think you're right. The people surrendered because the living God told them to. And he never used the word surrender. He said, you must bear the unbearable. And they never did. Hey, we've been real serious for a long time here. Do we have time for one C story? Here comes the C stories. We've got 5 minutes, maybe it'll be a little bit of a break.
I've got one question that's still serious. That is one position on dropping the atomic bomb. Do you, at this time, you know, there's a lot of theories on why that bomb was dropped, and or those two bombs were dropped. So do you foresee any possibility that that decision was questionable, in retrospect?
Oh, hey, yeah, sure. If I had known 50 years ago what I know today, that would change my thinking, yeah. But at the time, we were in death throes with Japan.
Okay.
And that's why I told the kids a little earlier, you can't judge the past by today's standards or today's ethics. You have to judge them by the standards and ethics at the time. And at the time, we could very easily have lost. Hey, and you know, maybe there are some lessons to be learned. What do you suppose, you know, I'm thinking of Saddam Hussein and the problems in the Middle East. What do you suppose would happen if we had left Hitler in charge in Germany when the war was over? And if we had left Mussolini in charge in Italy and the Japanese military, you know, it would have been a simple military victory. Boy, would the world be different today, huh? Yeah, right. But where would your freedom be? Where would you be? Yeah. Okay, well, maybe we do have time for I know this is going to make me sound like a real klutz, but what the heck. Now, I'm sure you've all seen World War II submarines, right?
You're quite an artist, Frank.
Okay, let's say that's about what it looks like. Here's the deck, the conning tower, here's the hatch. And this also happened out on the long. See, I told you I was on a submarine tender, you know, a mothership for submarines. And when submarines would come in during World War II, the first thing you do is you get those guys off the ship and you get them to a rest camp, because they've been at sea for 40, 50, 60 days, maybe longer than that. They haven't had a breath of fresh air. All the air they breathe tastes like diesel oil. They haven't seen the sun, the stars, anything. You know, they're simply inside this long tube for all that time. And they go out around the Japanese islands and sink whatever they can and then come back in, and they're pretty well washed out. You get them to the rest camp and you put on board what we call a relief crew. Now these are other submariners. Some of them will take that ship out next time. They'll change places with the guys who are on board. But first we go through, we clean up the whole ship, repair all the machinery, the radios, everything. Now I told you we didn't have any submarine base out in Guam. That we had, it looked like a cruise ship nowadays. And we had this submarine tender, but the quarters on it are not like a cruise ship. They're machine shops, radio shops. They're designed to repair these submarines, have everything they need. They can even lift part of them out of the water if they need to work on the propellers or something, right? So anyway, and we live aboard that ship except when the submarine comes in. So I was on this relief crew, and we went aboard that day and we started cleaning up the ship, getting it ready. But you know, the first night was always something special, because then the submarine's torpedoes ran on alcohol. Think about that for a minute. You get alcohol and sailors together, and you know, you never know quite what's going to happen, right? So anyway, this happened on, I suppose, the blackest night I've ever seen in my life. You know, you could hardly see your hand in front of your face. Now, we never started these parties during work time. We usually wait till about 7, 8 o'clock when the officers have gone back to tender, and we open up some of this alcohol and have a party. Well, as good a party as you can have without girls, anyway. And about 11:30, one of the guys had about all he could handle, and he was going to go back aboard the tender. So he struggles up here, up the ladder, goes forward to the conning tower, gets about here, and passes out. Well, about 15 minutes later, it's time for me to go on deck watch. See, you always have to have an armed guard on all the submarines, you know. You carry a .45. And all you do to go on watch on the submarine is you go forward to the conning tower, you meet the guy who's already on watch. He hands you the log book, takes off the pistol belt, you snap it on. You take the, now this is not a 6-shooter, it's a Colt 45 automatic. You take the pistol out, take the ammunition clip out of the pistol, pull the slide back to make sure that there's no ammunition in the chamber, click the trigger, back goes the ammunition into the holster, and then you're on watch. Right? Well, I guess I wasn't feeling any good that particular night because, like I said, we're tied up to this big tender, and I went on watch, and I took the logbook from the guy, strapped the pistol belt on, pulled the pistol out, pulled the slide. What did I forget to do? Forgot to take the ammunition clip out. Yeah. And so when I clicked the trigger, it didn't go click. Oh man, it boomed like one of those 3-inch guns. And about that soon, huge spotlight on the tender shines down on me. I'm standing on deck with a smoking pistol in my hand. And here's the guy flaked out on deck. Oh, boy. They had officers swarming all over that submarine in about 5 minutes, and they broke up the party. And guys didn't talk to me for about a week. But Joe, did you have anything else, or Harry?
No.
Any questions?
Any other questions?
You said that there were men trapped below in Pearl Harbor.
Any what?
Men trapped in the ship.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Were any of them able to get out, or were
Joe got out.
right? But from like the holds for like long periods.
A lot of them died. Like Harry said, on his ship, the guys lived for a good
16 days there.
16 days.
And people still couldn't get them.
Couldn't get them. Oh, but it was amazing. The Oklahoma here actually turned over. And about as soon as she did, guys from the Navy Yard and some of these other ships went over, crawled up on the bottom with acetylene torches and tried cutting holes in the bottom to let them out. Of course, you know, you've got a special problem here. When the ship is turned over, water will come in just so far and compress the air, right? And what happens if you cut a hole up here? As soon as you get a small hole in there, you know, a pinhole, the air will rush out, the water rushes. And what happens to the guys who are in there? So you have to be awfully careful about trying to rescue people who were trapped like that. And this was the case with the West Virginia too, because, you know, what had happened is the ship sank those 10 feet. Well, okay, so they closed the hatch above them. But that part got full of water. They couldn't afford to open the hatch themselves, because all the water would pour in and they'd drown. So it isn't as if there was a ladder that went right straight up to the deck from there. Well, you've seen the inside of the ships, you know they're pretty complicated, right? Are there any other questions or comments, opinions?
If you hadn't been enlisted at this time, would you have joined the...
I tell you, I enlisted in several of the other guys that I know too, because we saw newsreel clips of what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese people. And I decided when I was about 17 years old, I didn't want to grow up in a world like that. And I was pretty sure that someday there was going to be trouble. And if there wasn't, I would try to make some of those. Well, it was really the things that the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese were doing was just inhumane. They were talking about the rape of Nanking. Nanking was a city which the Japanese invaded. And because the Chinese simply surrendered and didn't fight them, well, I told you how the Japanese felt about anybody who was surrendered. And they killed over 200,000 Chinese for no reason other than that they had contempt for the Chinese people. What kind of world is that to grow up in? Incidentally, back then, we had to have our parents' consent to join the Navy unless you were 21. Now that's down to 18. But you know, my dad was just an ordinary working man. He worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But I mean, he wasn't particularly well educated. He didn't have any inside views or anything like that. And when I wanted to enlist in the Navy, he refused to sign the papers. And then one day, he came home and he said, "You still want to join the Navy?" I said, "I sure do." See, this was Depression time. It was hard to get a job. I did. And he said, "Well, okay, I'll sign your papers then." Now, this was in 1940, in July of 1940. He said, "They're sending the fleet to the Pacific. That means there's going to be trouble with Japan, and I want you to have some training." So we all knew that Japan was coming. We didn't know how or when or where it would start. And that war we were plenty willing to fight. But so far as getting involved in Europe, we didn't want that. So, well, anyway, I think we're out of time. Pretty close.
Pretty much, yeah.